Ask almost any muscle car fan to name Ford's most legendary big block from the 429 family, and they'll say the same three words almost every time: the Boss 429. It's a fair answer, but it's also an incomplete one, because sitting right alongside that famous engine, in Ford showrooms across the exact same years, was a considerably more affordable, considerably more available V8 that hit just as hard off the line, dominated at the drag strip in ways the Boss 429 genuinely struggled to match, and today gets remembered by almost nobody outside the most dedicated Ford enthusiasts. This isn't a countdown of 10 different cars from a single model year. This is the story of one engine, the Ford 429 Cobra Jet, and its even fiercer sibling, the Super Cobra Jet, and why it deserves a lot more credit than history has ever given it. This is a story of an engine built to do the exact opposite job of its more famous cousin. Where the Boss 429 was engineered purely to satisfy NASCAR's rulebook, barely fitting inside a Mustang's engine bay at enormous expense, the Cobra Jet was engineered for one thing only: dominating an ordinary Friday night at the local drag strip, in a car an ordinary enthusiast could actually afford to buy, insure, and drive to work on Monday. By the time this episode is over, you'll understand exactly why that made it, in some very real ways, the more important engine of the two. By the end of the 1960s, Ford's engine lineup had grown genuinely complicated. The FE Series big block, dating back to the late 1950s, had carried Ford through the 427 and 428 Cobra Jet era, powering everything from NASCAR winners to drag strip Mustangs. But the FE was an aging design, heavy, and increasingly difficult to develop further. Ford's answer was an entirely new engine family, known internally as the 385 series, debuting for 1968 in the full-size Thunderbird and Lincoln Continental Mark III as the 429 cubic-inch V8. At that point, a smooth, torque-focused engine built for comfortable highway cruising, not quarter-mile domination. Everything changed when NASCAR forced Ford's hand. To keep pace with Chrysler's dominant Hemi, Ford needed a version of the 429 built for genuine racing, which became the legendary semi-hemispherical Boss 429, an engine so wide it required Ford to physically modify the Mustang's shock towers just to make it fit. But building race cars for NASCAR homologation is a very different job than building a fast, reliable, affordable street and strip engine for ordinary performance buyers. That second job fell to a considerably less glamorous, considerably less mythologized version of the very same 429 block, the Cobra Jet. The 429 Cobra Jet arrived partway through the 1970 model year, quietly replacing the outgoing 428 Cobra Jet as Ford's primary street performance big block. It shared its basic 385 series architecture with the Boss 429, but almost nothing else about its internal engineering. Where the Boss 429 used exotic, race-derived semi-hemispherical cylinder heads that demanded a specialized, expensive manufacturing process, the standard 429 Cobra Jet used considerably more conventional wedge-style heads, still generously sized with large ports and big valves, but built using ordinary production tooling that Ford could manufacture in genuinely large numbers, at a fraction of the Boss 429's cost. From the very beginning, it was engineered to be the practical, attainable performance option, the engine an ordinary Ford dealer could actually stock on the lot, rather than a homologation curiosity built in tiny batches to satisfy a racing rulebook. Don't mistake practical for mild. The 429 Cobra Jet was a genuinely capable performance engine in its own right. The package included enlarged cylinder heads with considerably bigger ports and valves than Ford's standard 429, stamped steel rocker arms, screw-in rocker studs on early production examples, and guide plates borrowed directly from the celebrated Boss 302's own valve train, all combined with a compression bump from 10.5 to 1 up to 11.3 to 1. A cast iron intake manifold fed a single 700 CFM Rochester carburetor, and Ford officially rated the finished engine at 370 horsepower and 450 pound-feet of torque, a genuine 35 to 40 horsepower increase over the outgoing 428 Cobra Jet it had just replaced. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most capable big-block street engines Ford had ever put into regular production, and it hadn't even reached its final, most serious form yet. For 1971, Ford went one step further, introducing the Super Cobra Jet, a genuinely serious upgrade built specifically for buyers who wanted to take their car directly to the quarter mile. The Super Cobra Jet added forged aluminum pistons in place of the standard cast units, a stronger 4-bolt main bearing block, a considerably larger oil pump, an external oil cooler, and a nodular cast iron crankshaft built to survive sustained high RPM abuse, along with the mechanical camshaft featuring adjustable rocker arms and the larger 780 CFM Holley carburetor in place of the standard Cobra Jet's Rochester unit. Officially, Ford rated the Super Cobra Jet at just 375 horsepower, a mere 5 horsepower bump over the standard Cobra Jet on paper, a number that dramatically undersold exactly how much stronger this engine actually was underneath the surface. It's a detail worth sitting with for a moment. An engine with a genuinely stronger bottom end, forged internals, and the considerably more aggressive camshaft, officially rated just 5 horsepower above a considerably milder cast piston engine. Ford's own paperwork was quietly lying about this engine from the moment it was introduced. Unlike the Boss 429, which lived almost exclusively in the Mustang, the Cobra Jet and Super Cobra Jet spread their wings across a genuinely wide range of Ford and Mercury models. The Super Cobra Jet debuted for 1970 in the Ford Torino Cobra and its Mercury sibling, the Cyclone Spoiler, both mid-size performance cars built specifically to carry a genuine big block without the packaging compromises the smaller Mustang demanded. For 1971, Ford brought the Super Cobra Jet directly into the freshly restyled Mustang Mach 1 as part of the drag pack option, giving Mustang buyers access to genuine forged internal performance for the very first time since the Boss 429's own retirement. In every application, the Super Cobra Jet was paired exclusively with the drag pack option, Ford's way of signaling, quite directly, exactly what kind of driving this engine was built for. Ford wasn't being sloppy with those horsepower numbers. It was being strategic, in exactly the same way several other Detroit manufacturers were during this exact era. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, insurance companies had started paying very close attention to advertised horsepower ratings when calculating premiums, and manufacturers across the entire industry had learned that a lower official number on the window sticker could mean the difference between a car young buyers could actually afford to insure and one they couldn't. A Super Cobra Jet genuinely capable of well over 400 horsepower on a dyno, wearing an official rating of 375, wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated decision, made with full knowledge that anyone who actually raced the car would find out exactly how much power it really carried the very first time they dropped the clutch. On paper, the Boss 429 was always going to win the mythology contest. It was rarer, it raced in NASCAR, and it carried genuinely exotic engineering under its valve covers. But on an actual quarter-mile drag strip, the story often looked very different. The Boss 429's semi-hemispherical heads and tall deck architecture were optimized for high RPM breathing at sustained NASCAR speeds, which meant the engine needed real RPM and real setup work to show its full potential, genuinely difficult to extract in a stock, showroom-conditioned street car. The Super Cobra Jet, by contrast, was tuned from the factory specifically to make its power low and hard, exactly where a drag racer needed it off the starting line. Where the Boss demanded space and RPM to shine, the Super Cobra Jet made its presence felt immediately, and it built a genuine reputation among period racers as one of the hardest launching factory engines Ford had ever built. Here's a detail that tells you almost everything you need to know about how these two Cobra Jet variants actually compared to one another on paper. Stepping up from the standard 429 Cobra Jet to the forged internal Super Cobra Jet cost roughly $500 additional at the dealership, and according to Ford's own official specifications, netted the buyer exactly 15 additional advertised horsepower. 15 horsepower for $500 was a genuinely poor value proposition if you took Ford's paperwork at face value. But almost nobody who actually understood these engines took that number at face value. The real difference wasn't 15 horsepower, it was a stronger bottom end, forged pistons instead of cast ones, and an engine built to survive genuine repeated abuse at the drag strip without coming apart. The kind of difference that mattered enormously to a serious racer and meant almost nothing on a factory spec sheet designed to keep insurance premiums manageable. If the Cobra Jet and Super Cobra Jet were genuinely this capable, why does almost nobody remember them the way they remember the Boss 429? Part of the answer is simple: scarcity and story. The Boss 429 was built in tiny numbers, exclusively in the Mustang, engineered around an almost absurd homologation requirement that forced Ford to outsource its own assembly to a specialty contractor just to make the engine physically fit. That's a genuinely great story, the kind that gets repeated in magazine articles and documentary specials for decades afterward. The Cobra Jet story is considerably less dramatic. A practical, reliable, widely available engine, built across multiple models, built using largely conventional production techniques. It did its job extremely well, it just didn't come with the kind of only in Detroit mythology that keeps an engine's name alive in popular memory for half a century afterward. Like almost every engine covered across this entire series, the Cobra Jet family didn't survive the emissions crackdown of the early 1970s. Ford discontinued both the standard 429 Cobra Jet and the Super Cobra Jet after the 1971 model year, largely due to tightening emissions restrictions that made their higher compression ratios and aggressive camshaft profiles increasingly difficult to certify. That left only a considerably milder 351 Cleveland Cobra Jet carrying the name through 1972 to 1974, an engine that by most period accounts didn't even outperform Ford's standard 351, let alone come close to matching the earlier big block Cobra Jets it had replaced. By 1975, the original Cobra Jet lineage had effectively disappeared from Ford's production lineup entirely, not to return in any meaningful form until a specialty drag racing revival decades later. The 429 cubic inch block itself was phased out of production entirely by 1973, replacing Ford's lineup by its longer stroke sibling, the 460 cubic inch V8, which continued in various forms for years afterward, primarily in trucks and full-size cars rather than genuine performance applications. The same basic emissions and compression pressures that had killed the Cobra Jet also steadily strangled the 460's own output. From a genuinely strong 360 horsepower when it first appeared in 1968, down to just 212 horsepower by 1972, and a mere 200 horsepower by 1973 under the industry's newly adopted net rating standard. The Cobra Jet name itself never fully disappeared from Ford's history. It would return decades later, in 2008, as a badge for a series of purpose-built, VIN-less drag racing Mustangs, built to honor the exact same 1968 NHRA Winter National victory that had first put the Cobra Jet name on the map. But the original 429 Cobra Jet and Super Cobra Jet, the engines that actually earned that reputation on real drag strips in 1970 and 1971, never got a proper comeback of their own. There's a certain irony in how thoroughly the Super Cobra Jet has been overshadowed by its more famous sibling, because in almost every practical sense, it did exactly what it was designed to do better than the Boss 429 ever managed. It was more affordable, it was more widely available across more models for more buyers. It launched harder off the line in stock street trim, exactly where an ordinary weekend racer actually needed the power. And it quietly built a reputation among the people who actually raced these cars, rather than the people who simply admired them from a magazine cover. The Boss 429 will always own the history books, and it deserves plenty of that credit. But if you were an actual Ford performance buyer standing in a dealership in 1971, genuinely trying to decide how to spend your money on a car that would win at the local strip on Friday night, there's a very real argument that the Super Cobra Jet, sitting quietly in the option list of a considerably more affordable Mach 1, was the smarter, harder-hitting choice all along. So what does this engine story actually prove? That the most famous name in a manufacturer's own history isn't always the most capable one built during that same era. That a genuinely great performance engine doesn't need an exotic homologation story to earn its reputation. Sometimes it just needs to consistently win at the one place that actually mattered to the people buying it. And that Detroit's own deliberate horsepower under ratings, meant to protect buyers from insurance surcharges, ended up quietly burying some genuinely remarkable engineering underneath a number that never told the full story in the first place. The 429 Cobra Jet and Super Cobra Jet never got the magazine covers, the NASCAR victories, or the decades of collector mythology that turned the Boss 429 into a legend. But for 2 brief model years, sitting quietly in the option list of an ordinary Torino or Mustang, they built some of the hardest-hitting, most genuinely underrated street performance Ford ever put into regular production, and they deserve to be remembered as something considerably more than a footnote to their far more famous sibling. Did you know Ford had a second 429 big block hiding next to the legendary Boss 429? Or is this the first time you're hearing the Cobra Jet side of the story? Did your father, your uncle, or a neighbor on your street ever own a Torino Cobra, a Cyclone Spoiler, or a Mach 1 with a genuine Super Cobra Jet under the hood? Write the story in the comments below.